The courtroom of Judge was a monument to formality and justice, with its soaring ceilings, imposing mahogany furniture, and the Great Seal of Texas emblazoned on the wall behind the judge's bench. On this particular Tuesday morning in March, the usually austere chamber thrummed with an almost palpable energy, the kind that comes when a case touches something fundamental in society's conscience. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation and the weight of competing emotions that seemed to press against the walls themselves. Sat rigidly in the defendant's chair, his shoulders hunched slightly forward despite his attorney's earlier instructions to maintain an upright, dignified posture. His hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the wooden table before him, his knuckles bleached white from the pressure. The man had aged dramatically during the course of the trial. What had once been a relatively healthy, middle-aged entrepreneur now appeared gaunt and hollow, as though the proceedings had drained the very essence from him. His designer suit hung loose on his frame, and his hair, previously meticulously groomed, had gone unkempt and gray at the temples. He refused to meet anyone's eyes, instead staring fixedly at the polished surface of the table in front of him. Judge was preparing for what would likely be her most significant ruling in a career spanning 23 years on the bench. She was a woman known throughout the legal community for her unwavering commitment to justice and her absolute refusal to be swayed by emotion or public opinion. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and her expression remained impassive as she reviewed her notes one final time. She had presided over the entire 5-week trial with characteristic precision and fairness, never allowing personal feelings to color her judicial demeanor. Yet even she could not deny the emotional weight of this particular case. The details that had emerged during testimony had been, at times, almost unbearable to hear. The gallery behind the bar was packed to capacity, with standing room only at the back. The usual demographic of courthouse observers had been supplemented by a significant contingent of media representatives, animal welfare advocates, and concerned citizens. Camera equipment lined the back wall, operated by photographers and videographers who would broadcast the proceedings to news outlets across the state and beyond. This was no longer just a local trial. It had become a focal point for a national conversation about animal welfare and corporate responsibility. To one side of the courtroom sat the animal rights activists and welfare advocates. Many wore ribbons and buttons bearing images of dogs, their faces etched with a mix of hope and barely contained anger. They had attended nearly every day of the trial, taking detailed notes and occasionally having to be reminded by the bailiff to maintain courtroom decorum. Several clutched photographs of animals, personal mementos of the suffering they had witnessed in the documentation presented during trial. Their presence was a silent but powerful testimony to the impact of the case. The prosecution team occupied the table to the judge's right. Lead prosecutor Sarah Mitchell sat with her notes organized meticulously before her, every document precisely aligned, every highlight mark purposeful. She was a formidable adversary in any courtroom, known for her thorough preparation and her ability to present complex information in compelling ways. Behind her sat two younger assistant prosecutors and several investigative officers who had worked the case for over a year. They had built what appeared to be an airtight case, supported by photographs, veterinary expert testimony, financial records, and witness statements from former employees. The defense table, where sat with his expensive legal representation, was notably quieter and more defensive in demeanor. His attorney, Richard, was skilled and experienced, but even he seemed to recognize that this was an uphill battle. He had argued vigorously for his client throughout the trial, mounting every defense strategy available to him, but the weight of evidence had been relentless and damning. His face bore the resigned expression of a man who has done his job thoroughly, but suspects the outcome is likely beyond his ability to influence. Outside the courthouse, the scene was equally extraordinary. A crowd of approximately 200 people had gathered on the courthouse steps, held back by police barriers and security personnel. Signs and placards filled the outdoor space. Justice for the animals. Shut down puppy mills. Animals have rights too. News vans with satellite dishes lined the street, reporters practicing their on-camera presentations while waiting for updates they could broadcast to their audiences. The atmosphere outside was part protest, part vigil. People had come to bear witness to what they hoped would be a watershed moment for animal protection. Inside the courtroom, every eye was fixed on the proceedings. The media photographers had been positioned in designated areas, their cameras silent but perpetually ready to capture any significant moment. The public gallery was completely silent, no rustling of papers, no whispered conversations. Everyone present understood they were witnessing something consequential. The case itself had shocked the nation with its revelations. This breeding facility, located in rural East Texas, had appeared to be a legitimate operation on the surface. It was registered as a licensed breeding company with basic regulatory requirements and maintained a website showcasing healthy-looking puppies. But the reality behind the polished facade had been nightmarish. An investigation initiated following an anonymous tip had revealed conditions that violated basic standards of animal care and welfare. Hundreds of dogs had been confined to inadequate spaces, provided insufficient food and water, necessary medical attention, and subjected to breeding practices that prioritized profit over animal health. The veterinary experts who had during the trial painted a picture of systematic abuse and neglect. There were photographs, difficult to view and more difficult still to hear described, of emaciated animals, dogs with untreated infections, puppies born to malnourished mothers in unsanitary conditions. The testimony of animal control officers who had participated in the rescue had been particularly harrowing, with several breaking down emotionally as they described what they had witnessed. Now, after all the testimony, all the evidence, all the arguments from both sides, Judge was ready to deliver her sentence. Everyone in the courtroom understood that this verdict would send a message, either that animal cruelty would be treated with the utmost seriousness, or that such offenses could be handled lightly by the justice system. The stakes felt enormous. His hands continued to tremble. His attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder but barely seemed to notice. The moment of reckoning was at hand. No one in that courtroom, with all their careful preparation and anticipation, could have imagined what was about to unfold. No one could have predicted that the most powerful evidence, the most compelling testimony, was about to arrive in the most unexpected way possible. The electric tension in the air seemed to intensify, as though the very universe was holding its breath before something extraordinary occurred. Emma had barely slept the night before. She sat on the edge of her bed in the pre-dawn darkness, hands clasped together so tightly that her nails dug small crescents into her palms. She had wrestled with her decision for weeks, whether to bring Sophie to the trial or leave her in the care of her mother. The argument for leaving Sophie home seemed more logical. Why expose a 3-year-old to such a disturbing proceeding? Why subject the child to the pain and complexity of understanding that her father had done terrible things? But the counter-argument had won out. Emma believed, perhaps naively, that witnessing justice being served might help Sophie understand that the world had rules, that actions had consequences, and that even when people we love do wrong things, the system worked to address those wrongs. Emma rose from the bed and moved quietly through her small apartment to Sophie's bedroom. The morning light was just beginning to filter through the curtains, painting everything in shades of gray and blue. Sophie lay in her toddler bed, surrounded by an array of stuffed animals, bears, rabbits, and one particularly beloved stuffed dog with floppy ears that Sophie had named Buttons. The little girl was curled on her side, her thumb tucked into her mouth, her hair splayed across her pillow in wild disarray. Her chest rose and fell in the deep, peaceful rhythm of childhood sleep. Emma knelt beside the bed, watching her daughter for a long moment. Sophie looked so innocent, so untouched by the ugliness that had consumed their family over the past year. In the beginning, when the investigation into his facility had first started, Sophie had asked simple questions. Where's Daddy? When is Daddy coming home? Why is Daddy sad? Emma had tried to answer in ways a 3-year-old could understand, but there was no easy way to explain that her father had hurt animals, that he had been arrested, that their family was now fractured in ways that might never fully heal. "Sophie, baby," Emma whispered softly, gently brushing the hair from her daughter's forehead. "We need to get up now. We have to go to the big building today, remember?" Sophie's eyes fluttered open, still clouded with sleep. She regarded her mother with the uncomplicated gaze of young children, not yet burdened by the complications of the world. "The big building," she repeated, her voice still thick with sleep. "Yes, the courthouse," Emma said gently, "where we talked about where the judge is." Sophie's face scrunched in thought. She had only a vague understanding of what they were doing, and Emma suspected that most of what would happen today would be beyond her comprehension. Emma had prepared her as best she could over the previous days, using simple language and age-appropriate explanations. She had told Sophie that they were going to a place where a very important person, a judge, would decide what should happen because Daddy had made some animals very sad and hurt. "Will Daddy be there?" Sophie asked, suddenly more awake. Emma felt her heart clench. "Yes, sweetheart, Daddy will be there, but we won't be able to talk to him. We'll just be watching and listening." They moved through the morning routine with practiced efficiency. Emma had become adept at managing the tasks of parenthood alone over the past months. She bathed Sophie in warm water, washed her hair carefully to avoid getting soap in her eyes, and dried her with a fluffy towel. Then came the important part, choosing Sophie's outfit. Emma had deliberately selected Sophie's favorite pink dress with the dancing unicorns across the front. If they were going to be in this formal, intimidating space, at least Sophie should wear something that made her feel comfortable and special. Sophie stood in front of Emma's bedroom mirror, watching as her mother brushed her hair and tied it back with a pink ribbon. "Am I pretty?" Sophie asked, a question she had begun asking frequently in the past months. "You're beautiful," Emma assured her, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "You're the most beautiful, best girl in the whole world." They left the apartment at 8:30 a.m., giving themselves plenty of time to navigate parking and security at the courthouse. Emma carried a small bag containing Sophie's coloring books, colored pencils, and a few quiet toys. She had learned through hard experience that keeping a 3-year-old occupied and calm in an adult environment required careful preparation and strategic distraction. The drive to the courthouse took 40 minutes, and Sophie chattered intermittently about her preschool friends, her favorite songs, and her hope that she might see a doggy today. Emma responded to her daughter's comments with appropriate enthusiasm, while her own mind churned with anxiety about the proceedings ahead. She thought about how the man she had married had become someone she no longer recognized. She thought about the animals that had suffered, about the rescue workers who had freed them, about Sophie's future, and how this day might shape her understanding of right and wrong. When they arrived at the courthouse, Emma was struck by the crowd. There were more people gathered than she had anticipated, protesters holding signs, media personnel setting up cameras, security officers checking credentials. Emma felt a flutter of uncertainty. Had bringing Sophie here been the right decision? The energy of the crowd felt volatile, charged with emotion and conviction. She held Sophie's hand firmly as they navigated through security screening. Sophie looked up at the imposing columns and high ceilings of the courthouse with wide eyes. "Big building," Sophie observed quietly, and Emma suppressed a sad smile. "Very big building," she agreed. They made their way into the courtroom, slipping in quietly near the back as the proceedings were about to resume. Emma found a bench in the gallery, away from the most intense activity but with a clear view. She settled Sophie onto the bench beside her and opened the coloring book, positioning it on Sophie's lap. She handed the little girl several colored pencils and whispered instructions to stay quiet and color her pictures. Sophie immediately became absorbed in her task, her tongue protruding slightly in concentration as she carefully colored a picture of a fairy. Emma watched her daughter for a moment, marveling at how quickly children could adapt to new situations, how they could remain content and engaged even in the most complex adult scenarios. Sophie had no idea what was really happening here, no understanding of the weight of the moment or its significance. Emma looked around the courtroom, taking in the scene. She saw the judge preparing her notes, the prosecutors organizing their final arguments, the defendant, her ex-husband, sitting with his head down. She saw the animal welfare advocates in the gallery, saw the media cameras, felt the collective will of so many people who believed justice needed to be served. She turned back to Sophie, who was now carefully coloring a butterfly. Her daughter hummed softly to herself, a simple melody Emma recognized from preschool. The innocence of that humming, the pure contentment of a 3-year-old absorbed in a coloring book, felt like a sanctuary from all the darkness surrounding them. Emma reached over and gently squeezed Sophie's shoulder, drawing comfort from the warmth and solidity of her daughter's small body. Little did Emma know that her decision to bring Sophie to court today would result in the most extraordinary moment of the entire trial, a moment that would change everything and become the turning point in achieving justice for the animals that had suffered. Officer James had been a K-9 handler for nearly a decade, and in that time, he had developed an almost telepathic connection with his partner, Rex. The German Shepherd had been by his side for 7 of those years, nearly half of both of their careers. Their bond went far beyond the typical handler-dog relationship. It was a partnership forged through countless hours of training, numerous dangerous situations, and the unspoken understanding that they relied on each other for safety and success. Knew Rex's moods, his habits, his quirks. He could tell by the angle of the dog's ears whether Rex was alert, relaxed, or suspicious. He could interpret the subtle shifts in the dog's body language the way other people read facial expressions. Rex was, by any measure, an exceptional police K-9. His pedigree was impeccable, tracing back to a long line of working dogs with excellent temperaments and strong drives. He had been trained extensively in explosive detection, narcotics detection, and suspect apprehension. He had received advanced certifications and had performed his duties with a professionalism and dedication that had earned him commendations and recognition within the department. More than once, Rex's keen nose and alert instincts had prevented potential security threats. He was, in every sense, an exemplary law enforcement dog. This particular morning, Officer had received his assignment briefing at the station at 6:00 a.m. He was scheduled to perform a routine security sweep at the courthouse before the significant sentencing hearing scheduled for 2:45 p.m. These courthouse security checks were standard protocol, especially for high-profile cases that attracted media attention and large crowds. The procedures were well established and typically routine, and Rex had performed dozens of similar sweeps with no incidents or complications. Had loaded Rex into the specially equipped police vehicle, securing the dog in his designated compartment with practiced efficiency. They had stopped at their favorite dog park on the way, allowing Rex an opportunity to exercise and burn off some energy before the day's duties. The dog had chased a tennis ball, played with a few other dogs, and generally enjoyed the morning sunshine. Had watched his partner with obvious affection, noting how the pure joy on Rex's face seemed to wash away the weight of their daily responsibilities. By 2:30 p.m. and Rex had arrived at the courthouse. The atmosphere outside was noticeably charged. There were more people gathered than usual, more media presence, more visible emotion. Could feel the weight of the occasion, could sense that this was a significant case. He had read some of the newspaper coverage, understood that the case involved animal cruelty allegations. He appreciated the irony that Rex, this noble, intelligent creature, would be performing security duties in a courtroom that was about to deliver justice on behalf of animals who had suffered mistreatment. As they entered the courthouse through the designated security entrance, went through the familiar process of checking in with courthouse security personnel. He presented his credentials, confirmed the protocol for the sweep, and received the all-clear to proceed. The courthouse staff were familiar with Rex. They had seen them on numerous occasions and treated them with professional courtesy. Walked Rex through the metal detector entrance, where courthouse security personnel who knew them both waved them through with practiced efficiency. They had worked with Rex enough times to know that the dog would not trigger any alarms or create complications. Rex walked calmly beside his handler, his leash held at a comfortable length, his demeanor professional and focused. The courtroom itself was substantially quieter than the general courthouse hallways. The proceedings were in recess, scheduled to resume at 2:45 p.m. This gave time to conduct a thorough security sweep before the major activity resumed. He nodded respectfully to the bailiff who stood by the courtroom door, receiving a nod of acknowledgement in return. And Rex entered the courtroom together. The space was impressive. High ceilings, imposing furniture, the Great Seal of the state emblazoned prominently. There were still people in the gallery, media personnel setting up equipment, some of the advocates and spectators who had decided to remain during the recess. And Rex began their methodical sweep, starting from the back of the courtroom and working their way forward in a systematic pattern. Rex's nose twitched periodically as they moved through the space. The dog was alert and engaged in his work, performing exactly as he had been trained. His ears perked forward, his eyes scanned the environment, his body language communicated professional attention. This was Rex at his best, focused, disciplined, dedicated to his task. Had performed hundreds of these sweeps. He understood the protocol completely. They would move through the courtroom, checking for any unauthorized devices or substances, ensuring that the environment was secure for the proceedings that were about to resume. It was routine work, important work, but routine nonetheless. Expected that in approximately 15 to 20 minutes, they would complete the sweep and exit the courtroom. Everything would be secure, the proceedings would resume as scheduled, and the case would move toward its conclusion. As they moved toward the front of the courtroom, observed the various people present. He saw the judge's clerk organizing documents at the judge's bench. He saw court reporters checking their equipment. He saw bailiffs positioned strategically throughout the space. Everything appeared normal, everything appeared secure. And Rex continued their systematic progression through the courtroom. The dog maintained his professional demeanor, occasionally sniffing at particular areas but showing no signs of concern or alert. Rex's training had ingrained in him the discipline to focus on his work, to ignore distractions, to remain completely professional in his duties. Paid careful attention to his dog, watching for any changes in Rex's behavior that might indicate a concern. But there was nothing. Rex was performing his duties exactly as expected, moving through the courtroom with the calm competence of a well-trained professional. The routine sweep continued exactly as it should. As they worked toward the rear portion of the courtroom, heading toward the gallery where spectators were seated, neither nor Rex had any indication that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Neither handler nor dog could have predicted that, in just a few moments, their routine, unremarkable security sweep would transform into something unprecedented. A moment that would become the fulcrum upon which the entire case would pivot. Checked his watch. They were making good time. The sweep would be completed well before the proceedings resumed at 2:45 p.m. He thought about the reports he would file, the routine conclusion of another routine security check. He had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that Rex was about to undergo a reaction so unusual and unprecedented that it would shock everyone present in the courtroom and reshape the entire trajectory of the case. They continued forward, moving toward the gallery. Officer remained alert and professional. Rex remained focused and disciplined. Neither of them understood that they were walking toward the most significant moment of their partnership, a moment that would test their bond and ultimately contribute to a profound and unexpected justice. Sophie had been contentedly absorbed in her coloring book for approximately 15 minutes when something shifted in the courtroom's atmosphere. The little girl had been methodically working her way through the pages, carefully selecting colored pencils from the assortment Emma had provided and concentrating with the earnest intensity that only young children could muster. Her tongue poked out slightly from between her lips, a habit she had developed when focusing on detailed tasks. She had completed several fairy pictures, a butterfly, and was now working on a picture of flowers when movement across the courtroom caught her attention. The colored pencil paused mid-stroke. Sophie's head lifted from the coloring book, her blue eyes, the same shade as her father's, tracking the movement she had perceived. Her small body tensed slightly, that subtle shift that occurs when a child's attention is captured by something unexpected. Emma, who had been watching the proceedings with focused intensity, didn't immediately notice that her daughter's attention had shifted. Sophie's gaze locked onto the figure moving through the courtroom. It was a large dog, bigger than any dog she had seen in recent memory. The animal had a magnificent coat of tan and black coloring, alert ears that pointed upward, and an air of professional composure that was almost palpable even from a distance. The dog moved with purpose and precision beside the uniformed officer, and something about the sight triggered a recognition in Sophie's young mind that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to emotion. For a moment, Sophie simply stared, her coloring book momentarily forgotten on her lap. Her eyes grew wider, reflecting the image of the dog as he moved through the courtroom. Then, as the full recognition struck her, Sophie's entire body seemed to come alive with excitement. Her small frame practically vibrated with the intensity of her emotional reaction. She scrambled to stand up on the bench, abandoning her coloring book without a second thought. "Doggy, doggy," Sophie's voice cut through the courtroom with the clarity and force that only a 3-year-old's unfiltered excitement could produce. Her voice was high-pitched, joyful, and completely unrestrained by the formality of the setting. She pointed with an outstretched arm directly at Rex, her finger extended like an arrow aimed at the German shepherd. Emma immediately reached out to gently pull her daughter back down to sitting position. "Sophie," she whispered urgently, placing a reassuring hand on her daughter's shoulder. "We need to be quiet in here, remember, like we talked about." But Sophie was beyond the reach of quiet compliance. Her entire being was focused on the dog across the courtroom, and the recognition that flooded through her was so powerful that all other considerations seemed to fade away. She wiggled slightly in her mother's grasp, her eyes never leaving Rex, her enthusiasm barely contained by Emma's gentle pressure. What happened next would forever be etched in the memories of everyone present in the courtroom. Officer and Rex had been continuing their systematic sweep, moving methodically through the gallery area. Rex's professional demeanor was exactly as it had been throughout the security check, alert, focused, and completely under control. But the moment Sophie's voice rang out, clear, high, and filled with unmistakable recognition, something extraordinary occurred. Rex's head snapped toward the sound with such speed and force that it startled Officer. The dog's entire body seemed to go rigid for a microsecond before explosive energy coursed through him. His professional composure shattered completely, replaced by a reaction so intense and uncontrolled that it shocked everyone who witnessed it, most of all his longtime handler. The leash suddenly became taut as Rex began pulling with surprising strength, straining against the restraint with a desperation that seemed almost primal. Officer, who had handled this dog for 7 years and had never experienced anything remotely like this behavior, struggled to maintain control. His arm was yanked forward as Rex pulled with increasing urgency, his focus completely consumed by the sound of the small child's voice and her direction. "Whoa, Rex, heel," commanded, his training instincts kicking in as he attempted to regain control of his partner. But for the first time in their partnership, Rex seemed almost incapable of responding to the command. The dog's entire being was consumed by something deeper than training, something more fundamental than discipline. His tail began wagging with frantic intensity. His body pressed forward in a display of emotional expression that was completely atypical for a working police dog in the middle of a security procedure. The courtroom, which had been relatively quiet and orderly moments before, suddenly erupted in confusion. Several people in the gallery turned to look at Sophie and the commotion. The bailiffs, momentarily uncertain how to respond to this unusual situation, remained in their positions but watched with heightened attention. The judge's clerk looked up from her documents, confused by the sudden disturbance. Judge herself leaned forward in her chair, her sharp eyes narrowing as she observed the unprecedented scene unfolding before her. In her 23 years on the bench, she had never witnessed a police K-9 break protocol in such a dramatic fashion. The judicial mind that prided itself on order and procedure was instantly engaged by this anomaly. Emma struggled to keep Sophie seated, her own confusion growing as she witnessed the dog's dramatic reaction. "Sophie, please," she whispered more urgently, though her reprimand lacked the usual firmness. Even Emma could sense that something extraordinary was occurring, something beyond the normal parameters of courtroom procedures. Officer continued to struggle with Rex, who was now pulling with such force that the handler had to brace himself to avoid being dragged forward. The dog's entire body language communicated an intensity of emotion that transcended his years of professional training. It was as though some powerful memory, some deep connection, had suddenly awakened in him with overwhelming force. Rex's eyes were locked on Sophie, tracking her every movement, his body oriented completely toward the small child in the back gallery. The usually composed, disciplined police dog had been transformed into a creature driven by pure emotion and recognition. His whining sounds, soft at first, then growing in intensity, communicated a yearning that was almost heartbreaking in its rawness. The prosecutor paused mid-conversation. The defense attorney looked up from his notes. The animal welfare advocates in the gallery leaned forward with sudden, intense focus. Everyone in the courtroom was now watching the unfolding drama: the small child, the police officer struggling to maintain control of his dog, and the inexplicable, unprecedented emotional display from a trained police K-9. Sophie, despite her mother's gentle attempts to keep her seated, continued to strain toward the dog. "Doggy, doggy," she repeated, her voice carrying the same joyful recognition, the same unfiltered emotion that had triggered the dog's dramatic reaction. In that moment, with Sophie pointing and calling out, and Rex desperately straining against the leash while making sounds of recognition and yearning, nobody in that courtroom could have imagined the revelation that was about to unfold. Nobody understood yet that they were witnessing the manifestation of an impossible, unbreakable bond, a connection that had survived months of separation, trauma, and fundamentally different life circumstances. Officer's expression shifted from confusion to dawning curiosity as he struggled to understand what was happening to his normally impeccable partner. He looked at the small child, then back at Rex, his mind beginning to race with questions and possibilities. Something extraordinary was occurring, something that explanation within the normal parameters of his experience. The courtroom hung suspended in that moment of charged uncertainty, waiting for someone to make sense of what they were all witnessing. Officer James's mind was reeling as he fought to maintain control of Rex, who continued to strain against the leash with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. Years of training had taught to process unexpected situations with a degree of professional calm, but this was pushing the boundaries of anything he had experienced in his law enforcement career. Rex, his steady, reliable partner, was behaving in a manner that every protocol and expectation. His first instinct was to extract Rex from the courtroom immediately, to apologize to Judge for the disruption, and to figure out what was happening to his normally impeccable partner. But something held him back from that immediate action. The recognition in the dog's eyes, the intensity of the reaction, the way Rex's entire body seemed to vibrate with some deep, primal emotion. It suggested that something significant was occurring, something that deserved to be understood rather than simply managed. The bailiff moved toward Officer, uncertainty evident on his face. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his hand hovering near his belt, uncertain whether he might need to intervene in some way. "I'm not sure," responded, his eyes still locked on his partner. "Rex has never acted like this before. Something's wrong, or something's—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought because he genuinely didn't know how to characterize what he was witnessing. Judge, who had been about to reconvene the proceedings, paused. Her judicial instincts told her that this was not a simple behavioral problem or a minor courtroom disruption. There was something more to this, something that demanded attention rather than dismissal. She set down her gavel and observed the scene with the careful attention she typically reserved for complex legal arguments. "Officer," the judge called out, her voice carrying the authority of her position, "please explain what's happening with your dog." Sweat beginning to form on his brow from the effort of restraining Rex, looked up at the judge. "Your Honor, I honestly don't know. Rex is exhibiting behavior I've never seen from him before. He's responding to that child over there, but I can't explain why." He gestured vaguely in Sophie's direction while maintaining a firm grip on Rex's leash. It was then that Officer made a decision that would prove to be absolutely critical. Instead of simply removing Rex from the courtroom, he decided to consult the detailed documentation he maintained regarding his K-9 partner. He pulled out his department-issued tablet, never releasing his grip on Rex's leash, and opened the K-9 database that tracked his dog's history, including all relevant incidents and background information. As scrolled through the information, his expression shifted from confusion to shock. His eyes widened and his face grew pale. His finger froze on the screen, and for a moment he seemed to be reading and rereading the same information, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. "Your Honor," said slowly, his voice carrying a new note of uncertainty mixed with dawning comprehension, "I think I need to report something that I just discovered in Rex's file." Every person in the courtroom seemed to lean forward slightly, sensing that a revelation was imminent. "This dog," Officer continued, his voice growing stronger as the implications crashed over him, "was reported missing from the breeding facility 3 months ago. According to this record, Rex was discovered by animal control officers during their initial investigation of the facility. The report indicates that Rex was one of the animals rescued from the property." The courtroom seemed to hold its collective breath for a moment before erupting into gasps and urgent whispers. The implications of what Officer had just stated were immediately apparent to everyone present. This was not a coincidence, not a random occurrence. This was evidence, living and breathing, standing right in front of them. His head suddenly snapped up from the table where he had been staring. His face drained of color, and his attorney immediately placed a cautionary hand on his shoulder, warning him to remain composed. But it was too late. Reaction had been observed by dozens of people in the courtroom, and that reaction itself served as a confirmation. The animal welfare advocates in the gallery began to visibly react, some with tears, some with expressions of shock and vindication. The prosecutors exchanged rapid glances, their minds clearly racing through the implications of this revelation. Judge's expression had shifted from judicial neutrality to intense focus. "Officer," she said, her voice cutting through the noise of whispered conversations, "you're telling this court that the police dog currently in this courtroom was one of the animals allegedly abused and neglected at the defendant's facility?" "Yes, Your Honor," confirmed. "According to the documentation in our system, Rex was rescued from the facility and placed in our K-9 unit after undergoing rehabilitation and training. But what I'm struggling to understand is how he was identified and validated. There should be microchip records, registration information, something that would have documented his origin." One of the animal control officers seated in the gallery stood and approached the front of the courtroom. Officer Martinez, who had participated in the facility investigation, stepped forward and addressed the judge. "Your Honor, if I may," she said, receiving a nod of permission from Judge. "We did in fact discover Rex at the facility during our investigation. He was one of approximately 200 animals rescued from the property. When he was brought to our shelter, he was in extremely poor condition, severely malnourished, exhibiting signs of abuse, with visible scars and untreated infections." Officer Martinez pulled out her own tablet and began displaying photographs that had been taken during the rescue operation. The images showed Rex as he had been found, a stark contrast to the healthy, well-groomed dog that now stood in the courtroom. In the photographs, Rex appeared gaunt and broken, his once proud bearing replaced by an expression of fear and hopelessness. "We documented everything," Officer Martinez continued. "After the initial rescue, Rex underwent medical treatment, physical rehabilitation, and psychological therapy. He was monitored for several months before being evaluated for suitability as a police K-9. His recovery was remarkable, and his handler, officer, completed specialized training with him." The significance of what was unfolding seemed to crystallize in that moment. Here was Rex, a dog who had suffered terrible abuse and neglect at the facility, who had somehow survived and recovered, who had been placed with the police department. And now, in this moment, he was coming face to face with a child from the very facility where he had suffered. Sophie, throughout all of this, remained blissfully unaware of the significance of what was happening. She only knew that a dog she remembered, a creature that held some place in her young memory, was here in this courtroom. She was still trying to reach toward Rex, still calling out "Doggy, Doggy," with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. And Rex, for his part, was now being restrained not just by the leash, but by officers' growing understanding of what was occurring. The emotional reunion between a traumatized dog and a child from his past was becoming the most powerful testimony in the entire trial, a living, breathing, undeniable manifestation of the truth about what had happened at the facility. Officer looked at Rex, then at Sophie, then back at Officer Martinez, trying to process the profound implications of this moment. The dog's reaction to the child was not random or inexplicable. It was recognition, memory, and emotion transcending the months of separation and suffering. The courtroom had transformed from a formal legal proceeding into something more profound, a moment of truth made manifest through the impossible, unbreakable bond between a child and the animal that she had once cared for, even in the midst of systemic abuse and neglect. Judge sat back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin, as she processed what had just been revealed. Her sharp, analytical mind, honed by decades of jurisprudence and careful legal reasoning, was working overtime to grasp the full implications of what was unfolding before her. She had presided over countless trials, delivered hundreds of verdicts, and prided herself on her ability to separate emotion from law, personal feelings from judicial duty. But this moment was testing all of those principles in ways she had never anticipated. The judge's eyes moved from officer to Officer Martinez to the small child still pointing at the dog, and finally to Rex himself. The dog's body language was unmistakable. His entire being was oriented towards Sophie, his tail wagging with desperate intensity, his eyes locked on the child with a recognition that transcended any logical explanation. This was not a trained response, not a behavioral protocol. This was something far more fundamental, far more powerful. This was memory, emotion, and the unbreakable bond between a child and an animal. His mind raced through the evidence that had been presented during the 5-week trial. She recalled the veterinary expert's testimony about the systematic neglect and abuse at the facility. She remembered the photographs, images so disturbing that several members of the gallery had been compelled to leave the courtroom. She recalled the testimony of animal control officers who had described conditions that seemed almost incomprehensible in their severity. She thought of the former employees who had about the defendant's callous disregard for animal welfare, his focus on profit maximization at the expense of any ethical consideration. And now, standing before her in the courtroom, was a living embodiment of all that testimony. Rex represented not just one animal that had suffered, but the countless creatures who had endured the conditions at the facility. The dog's physical recovery was evident. He was healthy, well-groomed, clearly well cared for under officers' care. But his emotional response to Sophie suggested something deeper still. He remembered this place, he remembered this child, and despite everything he had endured, that memory remained intact. Judge understood something in that moment that transcended the legal particulars of the case. She understood that what she was witnessing was the most profound testimony that had been presented, not because it was new information, but because it was truth made visceral and undeniable. The bond between Sophie and Rex, the recognition that persisted despite months of separation and suffering, was a testament to something fundamental about the relationship between humans and animals. The judge leaned forward, her judicial instincts warring with her human emotion. She looked directly at, observing his reaction carefully. The defendant's face had gone ashen, and his body language communicated a mixture of shock and something that might have been recognition of his own culpability. His attorney was whispering urgently to him, but seemed barely able to register what was being said. "Officer," Judge said, her voice carrying the weight of her office and her careful consideration, "I need to understand something. This dog's reaction to the child, is this typical behavior for a police K-9? Officer, who had been watching Rex with an expression of wonder and dawning comprehension, responded immediately. "No, Your Honor, absolutely not. Rex is extensively trained to maintain professional composure in all circumstances. His behavior right now is completely atypical and unprecedented in my experience with him. The only explanation that makes sense is that he recognizes this child from his previous experience." "And how is that possible?" the judge pressed. "How could a dog remember a child after 3 months of separation, especially given the trauma he experienced?" Officer Martinez stepped forward again, her expertise clear in her bearing. "Your Honor, the bond between dogs and children can be remarkably powerful and persistent. Dogs have exceptional long-term memory, particularly regarding individuals and situations that held emotional significance. Sophie was in the facility during Rex's time there. Despite the negative conditions, the presence of a gentle child could have been one of the few positive experiences Rex had during that period. That memory appears to have survived intact." Judge nodded slowly, absorbing this information. Her understanding of the moment was deepening, expanding beyond the purely legal parameters of the case into something more profound about justice, truth, and the undeniable reality of suffering. "Bring the child closer," Judge commanded, surprising everyone in the courtroom. Several people looked taken aback by the unusual request, but the judge's tone was absolute, her judicial authority unquestionable. Emma, uncertain but trusting in the judge's authority, stood and gently lifted Sophie from the bench. She carried her daughter toward the front of the courtroom, moving carefully through the gallery. Officer, understanding the judge's intent, loosened his grip on Rex's leash slightly, giving the dog more freedom of movement while maintaining control. As Sophie was brought closer, Rex's emotional response intensified dramatically. The dog's whining became louder, his entire body vibrating with barely contained excitement. The moment Sophie came into closer proximity, Rex pressed forward, an officer, exercising his judgment as an experienced handler, allowed the dog to approach the child. Sophie reached out with her small hand, and Rex gently touched his nose to her fingers. The moment of contact was electric, filled with a recognition and reconnection that was almost tangible to everyone observing it. Sophie laughed with pure delight, running her small hand along Rex's head while the dog pressed close to her, his entire being communicating relief and joy at this reunion. Judge watched this scene unfold with an expression that few had ever witnessed on her face, genuine emotion breaking through her carefully maintained judicial reserve. She understood now, with absolute clarity, what she was witnessing. This was not just evidence. This was truth itself, made manifest through the impossible reunion between a child and the animal she had known and cared for in the midst of systemic abuse. The judge looked at the prosecutor, then at the defense attorney, then at the jury members who were observing this scene with visible emotion. She looked at the animal welfare advocates in the gallery, many of whom were now openly weeping. She looked at the media personnel, documenting this moment that would soon be broadcast to the world. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said quietly, recognizing the significance of the moment, "I believe the evidence is now complete." Judge nodded, her mind crystallizing into absolute certainty about the verdict she would deliver. This case had always been clear-cut based on the documentation and testimony, but this moment, this impossible, undeniable reunion, had transformed it into something more. It was no longer just a legal matter to be decided based on evidence and argumentation. It was a profound statement about justice, accountability, and the protection of those who could not protect themselves. She looked at who had collapsed back into his chair, his face in his hands. The defendant seemed to finally comprehend the full weight of what his actions had caused, not just in abstract terms, but in the concrete reality of a dog's suffering and a child's confusion about why her father had hurt innocent creatures. "Let the record show," Judge said, her voice carrying the formality of her office but also something warmer, something more human, that the court recognizes this moment as significant evidence of the profound and undeniable reality of the abuse and neglect that occurred at the defendant's facility. She turned her attention back to Sophie and Rex, watching as the small child and the rescued dog continued their emotional reunion. In that moment, Judge understood that she was not simply presiding over a legal case. She was participating in a moment of profound justice that transcended courtroom procedure and spoke to something fundamental about society's obligation to protect the innocent and hold accountable those who caused suffering. The courtroom had become a place where justice was not being decided by legal arguments and procedural rules alone, but by the undeniable truth of love, memory, and the unbreakable bonds that connected all living beings. The atmosphere in the courtroom had fundamentally shifted in ways that no amount of legal maneuvering could reverse. The energy that had permeated the space just moments before, the tension, the anticipation, the carefully maintained professional demeanor, had been replaced by something far more profound and emotionally resonant. The scene of Sophie and Rex reunited, the small child's delighted laughter mingling with the dog's soft whines of recognition, had become the defining image of the entire trial. The defense attorney, Richard, appeared to have physically shrunk in his chair. His face was pale, and his eyes moved repeatedly from Sophie and Rex to his client, as though trying to process how to respond to this unprecedented development. Had built his career on rigorous legal defense, on finding angles and arguments that could establish reasonable doubt or mitigating circumstances. But no amount of legal acumen could counter what everyone in that courtroom had just witnessed, the undeniable reality of a bond that had survived suffering and separation. Leaned toward and whispered urgently, his words inaudible to the courtroom but his body language communicating urgency and concern. Did not respond. The defendant sat with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking slightly in what appeared to be either suppressed emotion or the physical manifestation of psychological collapse. Whatever remaining denial he might have harbored seemed to have crumbled in the face of what he was witnessing. The animal welfare advocates seated in the gallery had abandoned all pretense of judicial composure. Tears streamed openly down their faces as they watched Sophie play gently with Rex, the small child's laughter creating a counterpoint to the formal, serious proceedings around her. Some clutched the photographs they had been holding throughout the trial, images of animals that had suffered, documentation of the conditions at the facility. Now those photographs had a living counterpart, Rex, who embodied both the suffering that had occurred and the miraculous recovery and redemption that was possible. Judge allowed the moment to continue for several minutes, seemingly understanding that this reunion served a purpose that transcended normal courtroom procedure. She did not rush to restore order or return to formal proceedings. Instead, she sat silently, observing, allowing the emotional reality of the moment to imprint itself on everyone present. It was Officer Martinez who finally stepped forward to continue the testimony that would solidify the evidence and make the day's proceedings even more conclusive. She approached the bench with purpose, and Judge nodded her forward. "Your Honor," Officer Martinez began, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes, "I have brought documentation that I believe is relevant to what we are witnessing today. With your permission, I would like to present the complete medical and behavioral records from Rex's rescue and rehabilitation." Judge gestured her permission, and Martinez began displaying detailed documentation on the courtroom screens. The records painted a comprehensive picture of Rex's condition when he had been discovered at the facility. Medical reports detailed severe malnutrition, parasitic infections, dental disease from poor hygiene, and skeletal deformities consistent with prolonged confinement in inadequate spaces. Photographs showed the progression of his recovery over the 3-month period following his rescue. "These scars," Martinez pointed to images showing healed wounds on Rex's body, "are consistent with the types of injuries sustained in the conditions documented at the facility. The timeline of Rex's recovery, combined with the microchip identification we conducted, definitively establishes that this dog was indeed one of the animals found at the property." The prosecutor, Sarah Mitchell, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I would like to note that Rex's recovery and subsequent service as a police K-9 stand as testimony not only to this dog's remarkable spirit, but also to the severe nature of the abuse and neglect he endured. The fact that he survived at all, given his condition upon rescue, speaks to the extremity of the circumstances at the facility." Mitchell paused, allowing her words to settle in the minds of everyone present. She then continued, "Moreover, the emotional response Rex demonstrated upon recognizing Sophie represents a powerful testimony to the bonds that form between animals and humans, bonds that persist despite trauma and separation. This is not circumstantial evidence or expert opinion. This is direct, observable evidence of the reality of what occurred at that facility." The courtroom fell silent as everyone absorbed the weight of this statement. Even the defense attorney seemed to recognize that further argument would be futile. The case had moved beyond the realm of argumentation into the territory of undeniable truth. Officer, still holding Rex's leash while allowing the dog to remain in proximity to Sophie, provided his own formal statement to the court. "Your Honor, in my 7 years of working with Rex, I have never witnessed this type of behavioral display. Rex is trained to maintain professional composure in all circumstances. This reaction to Sophie is entirely unprecedented and can only be explained by genuine recognition and emotional connection. There is no behavioral training, no command that would produce this type of response. This is pure instinct, pure emotion, pure memory." Judge leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful and resolute. She called for a brief recess, directing the bailiff to maintain order in the courtroom. As the judge stood to retire to her chambers, she issued a specific instruction. "Bailiff, please ensure that the child and the dog remain in close proximity. I have a sense that separating them at this point would be unnecessarily cruel, and it would not serve the interests of justice to do so." The bailiff nodded, understanding the deeper significance beneath the judge's words. This was not a statement of legal procedure. This was a statement of human compassion and recognition of the profound emotional reality that had been revealed. During the recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom remained charged with emotion. Officer Martinez remained near Sophie and Rex, observing the gentle interaction between child and dog. She pulled out additional documentation, behavioral reports, psychological evaluations, and rehabilitation notes that she prepared to present if necessary. But it seemed increasingly likely that such detailed presentation would be unnecessary. The evidence was clear, the verdict was evident, and even the defense team seemed to have conceded the inevitability of the outcome. Sat at the defense table with his attorney, but he barely seemed present. His eyes were fixed on the scene of Sophie and Rex together, and his expression communicated a level of remorse that no courtroom argument could have extracted from him. The physical reality of what his actions had caused, visible in the form of a small child's joy at being reunited with a dog that should never have suffered in the first place, seemed to have broken through whatever psychological defenses he had maintained. The media personnel in the courtroom were frantically taking notes and photographing the scene. They understood that this moment would become the defining image of the trial, not the legal arguments or the technical evidence, but the reunion between Sophie and Rex. This was the story that would move beyond the courthouse and touch the hearts of people across the nation. As the recess continued, Judge sat in her chambers, reviewing her notes and considering her verdict. She already knew what the outcome would be. The evidence had always been overwhelming, but now it had been elevated to something more. It had been given a face, a voice, and a heart. The abstract concept of animal suffering had been made concrete in the form of a dog's recognition and a child's joy. When the recess ended and Judge returned to the bench, her expression communicated absolute certainty. The proceedings were about to move into their final phase, and everyone in the courtroom understood that justice was about to be served with a clarity and finality that few cases ever achieved. The verdict was no longer in doubt. It was simply waiting to be formally stated. The courtroom was completely silent as Judge returned to the bench following the recess. Her expression was stern and resolved, carrying with it the weight of careful judicial consideration and the absolute clarity that comes from understanding not just the law, but the profound moral dimensions of justice itself. She settled into her chair and looked out across the courtroom, her gaze encompassing the prosecutors, the defense team, the jury members, the animal welfare advocates, the media representatives, and finally Sophie and Rex, who remained in gentle proximity to one another. "This court is now in session," the judge announced formally, though everyone present could sense that this was not an ordinary procedural moment. "I have considered all the evidence presented during this trial, the testimony of experts, the documentation of conditions at the defendant's facility, the physical evidence of suffering and neglect, and the extraordinary testimony that has unfolded before us today." Judge paused, allowing her words to settle into the minds of everyone present. She adjusted her glasses and consulted her notes one final time, though it was clear that she had already made her decision long before this moment. "I have been a judge for 23 years, she continued, her voice carrying the full authority of her office and her personal conviction. "In that time, I have presided over hundreds of trials, issued hundreds of verdicts, and attempted always to serve justice with fairness and appropriate severity according to the law. However, I must state for the record that I have never presided over a case that so clearly demonstrates the systematic and deliberate infliction of suffering on innocent, defenseless creatures." She turned her attention directly to, and her eyes seemed to pierce through every defense, every rationalization, every psychological barrier the defendant might have constructed. "You stand convicted of animal cruelty in the first degree, conviction on all counts. Your facility housed hundreds of animals in conditions that violated every standard of basic animal welfare. Your actions were motivated by profit, entirely indifferent to the suffering you caused." The prosecutor's team sat forward, their expressions reflecting satisfaction and vindication. The animal welfare advocates in the gallery seemed to collectively hold their breath, waiting for the judge to pronounce the sentence they had been hoping for. "However," Judge continued, and the tone of her voice shifted slightly, I wish to address something that goes beyond the legal parameters of this case. What we witnessed today, the reunion between a child and a dog, the recognition that persisted despite suffering and separation, represents something profound about the nature of justice itself. This case is no longer simply about legal violations or procedural matters. It is about society's fundamental obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves. She gestured toward Sophie and Rex. That small child represents innocence. That dog represents vulnerability and the absolute trust that animals place in humans. When we, as a society, allow that trust to be violated for profit or convenience, we fail in our most basic moral obligation. Today, in this courtroom, we have seen redemption. We have seen that recovery is possible, that healing is achievable, and that justice, when it is truly served, can restore dignity to those who have suffered. Judge looked back at. It is the sentence of this court that you be imprisoned for 5 years in state penitentiary. You will serve this sentence without possibility of parole reduction. Upon release, you will be subject to 5 years of supervised probation. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution in the amount of $250,000 to be distributed among animal rescue organizations and animal welfare advocacy groups. Most significantly, you are permanently barred from owning, breeding, or maintaining any animals for the remainder of your life. This ban is absolute and non-negotiable. As the words settled over the courtroom, there was a moment of profound silence before the animal welfare advocates erupted in tears and emotional expressions of relief. This was not just a conviction. It was a comprehensive statement of justice that addressed the crime, imposed meaningful consequences, and protected animals from any future harm that might inflict. The judge banged her gavel once definitively. This court is adjourned. The following 3 weeks were transformative in ways that nobody could have fully anticipated. The story of Sophie and Rex's reunion had captured the national imagination. Media outlets across the country had broadcast the footage of the small child and the rescued dog recognizing each other in the courtroom. The narrative of animal suffering followed by redemption resonated deeply with millions of people. Animal welfare organizations reported unprecedented increases in donations and volunteer applications. The trial had become a watershed moment for animal protection law. Legal scholars discussed its implications for future animal cruelty cases. Several state legislatures began considering strengthened animal welfare protections based partly on the publicity generated by this case. The trial became a rallying point for animal rights advocates who had long fought for stronger legal protections. Officer James received commendations from the police department for his role in the proceedings. His willingness to question and investigate Rex's unusual behavior had led directly to the revelation that had sealed the case. More importantly, his partnership with Rex had demonstrated that rescued animals could not only survive but thrive and contribute meaningfully to society. But perhaps the most significant moment came 3 weeks after the verdict, when Officer arranged a special visit for Emma and Sophie to see Rex at the police station. The officer had anticipated that this meeting might provide closure and healing for both Sophie and the dog. When Emma and Sophie arrived at the police station, Officer escorted them to a quiet area where Rex was waiting. The moment Sophie caught sight of her beloved companion, she squealed with delight and ran toward him. Rex, upon seeing the child, displayed the same intense recognition and joy that had captivated the courtroom. The dog pressed close to Sophie, and the small child wrapped her arms around his neck, laughing with pure, unself-conscious happiness. Emma watched the reunion with tears streaming down her face. She understood that this moment represented more than just a child and a dog being reunited. It represented healing, redemption, and the triumph of love and connection over suffering and betrayal. Sophie had lost her father to his own moral failings, but she had been given back the companionship of a beloved animal. Officer stood quietly to the side, documenting the moment with his phone camera. He understood that this reunion would become part of a larger narrative, the story of how a 3-year-old girl and a rescued dog had fundamentally changed the landscape of animal protection law in their state. Sophie spent an hour with Rex that afternoon, playing fetch in a secure yard, petting him, talking to him in the way that young children speak to animals, with complete openness and unguarded affection. Rex responded to every gesture with gentle devotion, his entire being expressing the joy of being with someone he remembered and loved. As the afternoon drew to a close, Emma helped Sophie say goodbye to Rex. The child hugged the dog one final time, and Officer promised that they could visit again soon. The separation was bittersweet. Sophie understood, in the way that young children sometimes do, that Rex had a different life now, that he had his own important work to do. In the months that followed, Sophie would visit Rex regularly at the police station. She would sit in on some of Rex's training sessions, watch as he performed his security duties, and understand gradually that her beloved companion had found a new purpose and a new family. Their bond, forged in the midst of suffering and neglect, had survived and blossomed into something beautiful, proof that love and connection transcended circumstance. The trial became a landmark case in animal welfare jurisprudence. Legal experts cited it for decades to come. But beyond the legal implications, the case had touched something deeper in the national consciousness, a recognition that our treatment of animals reflects our character as a society, and that justice for the voiceless is justice that elevates us all. Sophie grew up understanding that her father had done terrible things, but also that justice existed, that systems worked to protect the innocent, and that even in the midst of betrayal and suffering, redemption and healing were possible. She grew up with the knowledge that a small child's innocence and a rescued dog's love had changed the course of justice. And Rex continued his service as a police K-9, his remarkable recovery standing as testimony to resilience, the power of proper care, and the unbreakable bonds that connect humans and animals. Every time he served, every time he protected, Rex carried with him the memory of a small child's recognition, a moment in a courtroom that had changed everything.